Good evening, and thank you so much, Sylvia, and the organisers of this event for the invitation to be part of such an exciting conference. I've got good news for the students. There are schools in the UK where young people start at 11 o'clock in the morning because they've done research and they've discovered that teenagers work better later in the day. You know this already, but there's some research. Also, there's quite a lot of evidence that homework isn't a very good idea. So, you know, there's lots of people out there looking at it. Thank you for allowing me to speak in English, and thank you to the translators. It is fantastic to be in Berlin. I haven't been here for many, many years. My first visit was in 1987, when, as a schoolgirl, I visited the Reichstag with a German friend. I walked up the grand staircase and I looked out through the windows at the back of the building. And from there, I could see the control towers, the armed soldiers, the wall, and the no man's land beyond. My third visit, 2 years later, was completely different. I recall walking up to the Brandenburg Gate and hearing this huge, strange noise. I couldn't work out what it was. And as we got closer and closer, I suddenly realized it was the sound of thousands and thousands of people chipping holes in the wall, literally tearing it down with their hands and their hammers. And I found myself that evening, a couple of days before New Year's Eve in 1989, sitting on top of the wall, sharing a cigarette with the border guards. This is familiar history to many of you in this room, but it is important to remember that the world can change massively, quickly, and unexpectedly when we're talking, as we are in this conference, about educational futures. We need to remember that futures can be radically different from what we expect. So the question I want to explore with you this evening really is, what sorts of tomorrows should our schools prepare young people for? But before answering this question, and I'm going to do this a few times this evening, let's warm ourselves up by actually imagining ourselves, by placing ourselves in the future in some way. I want you to close your eyes for a minute. Don't worry, you are among friends, you're safe. I want you to think about the year 2037. How old will you be? And don't worry, you don't have to tell anybody. What will that world be like? What will stay the same? What will change? What are you basing your assumptions on? Okay, you can open your eyes now. What I wanted to do was to position ourselves in the future so that we know it's going to happen. It's not just a rhetorical flourish. So about 10 years ago, I gathered a group of international experts, children, young people, and educators to look at the sorts of trends that might impact on education to 2035. And I want to start this evening by running through some of these. So the first trend that we're looking at is a trend towards a globally aging society. We're experiencing globally massive demographic shift towards aging populations, the likes of which we have never seen before. By 2035, the likelihood is that 50% of the population of Western Europe will be aged over 50, with a further 40-year life expectancy, and a further 25% aged over 65. We have never lived in a society that is shaped like this, with equal numbers of older adults and children. And on top of this, Ray Kurzweil, the futurologist, says that if we live to 2020, we will be able to surf the waves of medical development, those of us who can afford the medical bills, and live for a few hundred years. What will lifelong learning look like in that context? The second trend that we want to think about is growing economic inequalities. There is a clear trend towards wealth being held by an ever smaller minority. The gap between the richest and poorest is likely to continue to increase, with the rungs on the employment ladder becoming harder and harder to climb. This brings huge implications for social cohesion. At the same time, just as automation and new forms of employment have hit the work of taxi drivers and factory workers, so too will automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics start affecting the previously seemingly secure middle-class jobs: doctors, lawyers, accountants. Who would you rather operated on you, the first-time surgeon or the robot who has 100,000 examples of the same operation to draw upon. Third trend, the social and economic impacts of climate change. Climate change will be, by definition, unpredictable and chaotic. Hands up who thought Berlin would be sunnier at this time of year. I have a new coat now, it's all good. The 2-degree temperature rise that we seem to be moving towards brings about a 45% species loss. It means huge costs to maintain public infrastructure in the face of more extreme weather. It means increasing movements of people from climate-stressed areas in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Fourth trend is technological trends. There are going to be a number of significant trends that we're likely to be living with, assuming our infrastructures survive the previous two issues. These trends include living in massively data-rich environments in which we ourselves become data centers. How many of you are wearing a personal tracking device or a Fitbit? How many have we got in this room? Have we got many? Oh, over there. That's where the techies are. Okay, yeah. You're at the forefront of the trend towards quantifying the self. But more interesting trends as well include the increasing collaboration we'll be having with non-human-like intelligence. We're already, every day, working within and with complex technological systems. We're dancing with them through our cities as we take transport systems, use Google, watch planes fly overhead. We're part of complex technical systems whose working we are completely unaware of. Did you know that over half the traffic on the internet is our devices talking to each other? But our collaborations with non-human intelligence, could you show the image, the film now? See if that works. Yeah. So our collaborations with non-human intelligence may become much more explicit, an experience of consciously working alongside new beings. We will get used to millions of tiny robots doing mundane tasks, or perhaps relying on humanoid robots to care for us in old age. And this little video is completely compelling. It's a packing office in China where they're sorting out parcels. And with changing technologies come changing ideas of what it means to be human. We can expect to be carrying massive resources of artificial intelligence in our pockets, supporting everyday tasks from instantaneous translation, apologies translators, to diagnosis of medical problems. And at the same time, genetics and neuroscience will offer us new forms of personalized medicine, new accounts of our capabilities, talents, and dispositions. And on this basis, we can imagine a situation in which educators will be faced with very different sorts of people in their schools. There may be new hippies whose parents resist any form of augmentation, sitting alongside young people who like to augment themselves with physical and digital attachments, sitting alongside those who are going the genetic and biological enhancement route. This will make for interesting classrooms. If this sounds fanciful, just consider the fact that in 2009, a survey in Nature reported that when asked whether healthy children under the age of 16 should be restricted from taking cognition-enhancing drugs, most respondents said they should. But 1/3 of respondents said that they would feel pressure to give cognition-enhancing drugs to their children if other children were taking them. Our technologies enter our social and cultural contexts. So since my first study 10 years ago, we have, of course, witnessed trends taking new forms and breeding uncertainty. We've witnessed the deepening and ongoing economic crisis, which is a crisis of inequalities and extraction of wealth by minorities. We've seen a resurgence of populist and nationalist sentiment, which puts the European project itself in doubt. And I speak as a British person who is in a state of trauma at the moment. We're seeing the return internationally of great power politics and the spectre of nuclear war. We've seen the first waves of international movements of people as a result of war, economics, and climate stress. But we've also, in that 10 years, seen the growth of social media to create a Twitter sphere we couldn't have imagined. We've seen the development of new energy sources. We've seen the growth of civil society and cities as forces in addressing climate change. We've also, and I came across this last week, we've discovered a worm that can eat plastic and make antifreeze. This is very cool, I think. We've also seen the development of a worldwide love affair with videos of cats and printers. So the point is, the world is a strange, changing, and complex place. These different social, technological, environmental, economic, and political forces will intersect to create the world we'll be living in 20 years. It will not just be technological change that determines our future, but the ways in which we respond to these changes economically, politically, and culturally. And what this means is that the future is both profoundly, creatively, and excitingly unknowable, and it is not predetermined. It can be shaped and influenced if we seek to act. So how then should education respond to the uncertainty of the future? Well, it means that education cannot be about preparing young people for a predictable, stable world. Instead, education's role in this uncertain world is to do two things. First, to prevent the closure of the future, by which I mean limiting it to one particular vision. The biggest risk we face as a species and as a planet is the loss of abundance, is over-specialization into one form of life, and the erosion of diversity. An urgent and important role for education, therefore, is to protect the diverse ways of knowing and being that there are in the world, because we do not know which of these will be important to our future survival. As we have already heard from both sets of speakers this evening, we need schools that value, nurture, and protect the differences that our students bring with them, and in turn support them to value, nurture, and protect difference themselves. The second job of education is to act as a midwife to bring new and better futures into the world that we cannot anticipate today. Schools have the potential to be the most astonishing places for inventing, creating, and reimagining futures. And indeed, this is what we've heard this evening from the students. They want to learn to live with and learn from their differences. They want to engage actively as makers and actors in the world. So, how can schools become laboratories for the future? Put simply, schools need to become places where students and teachers can do three things. The first of these is build the capacity to play with time and change, and I will explain what I mean by this shortly. The second is to use our subjects to face the future, not the past. And the third is to nurture friendship, love, and community. So what I'm going to do now is just talk through these things. So firstly, playing with time and change. If schools are to act as laboratories for the future, students need to be supported, and arguably we ourselves need to be supported, to see time, history, and change as complex, multi-layered, and open, and to see that this complexity is not a cause for panic, but a resource for creativity. What does this mean? Well, I'd just like you to think about how you visualize the relationship between past, present, and future. Again, close your eyes if this helps. What does this relationship between past, present, and future look like? What can you see? What images? Okay, you can open your eyes now. So some of you may have seen an arrow that runs from left to right. Left to right. That's my left to right. That's your left to right. From past to present. When we conjure up this sort of image, we're working with the idea of time as linear, with the past flowing into the present, into the future. Others may have seen a line that runs from the bottom left of your vision to the top right, and here we're adding something to our concept of linear time, an idea of progress towards a better future. Now, this is a classic post-Enlightenment, westernized vision of time and change, and it's one that education is deeply tied up with. But there are real problems with this particular conception of progress when we try to think creatively about our relationship with the future. First, this image of time and change as linear and ever moving forward risks complacency. We assume that the rights and achievements that we have secured don't need defending, that the peace we have achieved does not require constant nurture and care. It doesn't allow us to imagine that reversals are possible. Second, it immobilizes us when reversals do happen. We spend our energies working out how to fix the broken arrow, how to get back on the same track, instead of asking whether another route might be desirable. And one example of this is our response to the economic crisis of 2007 to 8. Since this time, we have spent our energies working out how to get back on track, rather than asking whether a different route might be possible and desirable. If we're going to create schools for the future, we need a more complex, rich, and resourceful set of images to support students' ideas of how change happens. And for this, we can look to other cultural traditions for thinking about time and change. Some of you, when you had your eyes shut, may have visualized time in a completely different way. Perhaps you saw time as a series of waves, as civilizations grow and collapse, as societies or populations rise and fall. The great 14th century Islamic sociologist Ibn Khaldun presented societies in this way. Others of you may have imagined cycles, the cycles of the year, of harvest, of new moons, of birth and death, of growth and decay. This is a familiar pattern from indigenous and agricultural traditions, as well as from many Eastern religions. Others of you may have imagined a crystal, a constantly emerging, growing form that will simply grow into different shapes as time moves on. The tree is a powerful symbol of time, knowledge, and growth in many traditions of thought. So seen from this richer perspective, what might be seen as a moment of crisis within a linear narrative of progress instead becomes a moment for the imagination to get to work. It is change, not disaster. It's part of a cycle, not a radical reversal. It is a moment of choice and decision where new branches and future possibilities might emerge. Today, our children in Europe and increasingly around the world are being told that the intergenerational contract is broken, that the old story of progress and gradual improvement in working conditions and expectations can't be sustained, and that they cannot hope for better than their parents. In this context, they and we need a new way of thinking about this moment of change, not as a moment of loss, but a moment for asking profound questions about whether radically different futures might be imagined and brought into being. We need to support our students to question whether there really is only one path towards a better future. And if they want to bring them into being, our children also need to know that change doesn't happen in one direction all the time. It is multi-layered, it is characterized by contradictory and competing forces that are not pulling in the same direction. Just as there is Donald Trump as president, so there are also counter movements at all different levels of society. We can show our children that change is made in many different ways through many different processes, from leadership to education to non-violence and violence to social movements, law, discoveries, and cultural creation. We have, in other words, to liberate our students and young people from the old story of a linear narrative of process and free them up to see time and change as complex, multi-layered, characterized by reversals and unintended consequences, and always opening up possibilities that are unexpected and creative. That's the theoretical bit. The second thing that we have to do, and this is much more practical, is to think creatively about the curriculum. And I have been to so many conferences on thinking about the future of education. And when we talk about thinking about curriculum redesign for schools, we often get focused on the idea that we need to teach lots of new things, usually 21st century skills. I want to suggest something altogether simpler. What we need to do is to flip the subjects we already teach from their past to their future orientation. So what do I mean? Well, what I mean is we need to stop thinking of subjects as bodies of knowledge and recognize that their very power is their capacity to help us deal with new information and work on the future in different ways. After all, disciplines were invented specifically to tackle an information crisis equivalent to the one we're facing today. They did not always exist. As Chad Wellman has shown in his brilliant book, Organizing Enlightenment, the disciplines or subjects were more or less invented here in Germany, in fact, by the Humboldt brothers, if you can say anybody does this, in the 18th century. And they were invented to deal with the huge proliferation that emerged after the democratization of printing and publishing. Before this time, being educated broadly meant that you'd read all the great books that had gone before and you wrote to all the other educated people about them. In the 18th century, though, there was an information revolution. Suddenly, everyone was reading and publishing, and new ideas and information was circulating ever more quickly. In this context, the old idea of education didn't work anymore. Instead, being educated meant that you need ways of dealing with new information, of working out how to make sense of it, and to connect it up with what had gone before. That meant you needed to specialize and realize that different bodies of knowledge, disciplines, required different ways of judging and making sense of new information. And so, we can understand a discipline or a subject in school less as a body of knowledge and more as a set of procedures for working out how we should deal with new information and change. In and of themselves, therefore, subjects are potentially future-facing. So what this means is that when we teach our subjects, we can flip them to face the future by ensuring that students are not seen merely as recipients of old knowledge, but as active co-producers and analysts of new information. We can see our students as writers, as scientists, as mathematicians, as historians, who are making the world as they learn. For the purpose of our conversation this evening, though, it's worth also noticing that our existing student subjects also do something else. Between them, they have the potential to teach 4 distinct ways of thinking about and creating the future. And these are often hidden within the subject, but I want to pull them out so that we can understand the work that they have the potential to do. First, our subjects have the potential to teach students to do the most powerful thing they can in thinking about the future. They can support students to create models of the future. This includes the development of mathematical models of the world in maths or simulations in science, but it's also the imagination of alternative worlds and ways of being in literature and theatre. Modelling is powerful because it supports students to play with variables, to examine and engender unintended consequences from their interactions, to explore how different scenarios might come into being, to imagine what it might be like to inhabit a different world. Second, our subjects teach students to steward, to look after information, knowledge, and life forms. Many of our subjects are concerned with supporting children to work out how to care for and preserve diversity into the future. They are encouraged to encounter and keep alive the huge range of ideas, language, ways of knowing and being that characterize the richness of human and material existence. Third, subjects teach reflexivity. They teach students to ask questions about the future that they are being sold. Linguistics, social science, statistics, and philosophy enable students to develop the capacity to analyze, unpick, and challenge narratives of the future. And finally, our subjects teach students to experiment. When done well, they teach students how to invent and reshape their world. This might range from the design of prototypes to the development of social innovations. This includes everything from design and engineering to computing and social sciences. So just as the Humboldt brothers realized that we needed to organize teaching and knowledge differently to deal with the information explosion of the Enlightenment, so we need to reorganize education today so that we can be clearer and more reflexive about the futures-making skills that education can teach. In particular, we need to recognize that being educated today involves the capacity to expertly and fluently move between using these 4 different skills, between stewardship, reflexivity, modeling, and experimentation. These might become our new faculties, replacing arts, science, and humanities. And we might expect our students to work well within all of them. By doing this, we overcome the problem that we've inherited from the Enlightenment, over-specialization, and instead enable the development of rounded students who are able to act ethically, creatively, and rigorously on the world. No more engineers who do not know how to preserve and cherish diversity. No more social scientists who only know how to critique and not to make. And I speak as a social scientist. So the third thing and final element of an education for open futures is arguably, I would say, the most important, namely the ability to understand, recognize, and work with the emotions that thinking about the future necessarily brings. So for one last time, I want you to take a minute and close your eyes and think about how you feel about different ideas of the future. For example, what are your feelings about a business-as-usual future if everything carries on pretty much as it does today? Or a future of crisis, of catastrophe, when everything descends into chaos? How do you feel about a future where we try to keep going, we just tighten our belts, limit ourselves, and try to fit within constraints? Or what about a future of radical transformation, where we make our way through to a significantly better way of organizing ourselves and our relations with the planet? These 4 stories of the future are what Jim Data calls the 4 core myths of the future: continuity, collapse, restraint, and transformation. And we all tend to be drawn towards one or other. What I'm interested in, though, is how you're feeling in response to these different possibilities. Are you feeling anxiety or hope? Is there desire or passion or deep-seated fear? And what does your emotion do to the way you think you make decisions in the present? If you haven't opened your eyes, do now. So often, we're driven by the desire to avoid futures that we may fear. But we need to note 2 things. The futures we may fear may bring beauty and possibilities we could never imagine. And here I'm reminded of the brilliant work by Sue Porter at my home university in Bristol that brought together environmental activists and disability campaigners to explore what it means to live with the loss of a future that had been hoped for. Together they explored the unexpected futures and the new directions that come from moments of disaster and sorrow. Second, we need to notice that hope and clinging to a future that we always thought we wanted can lead us into trouble. It can impede the chance for a new future to emerge. And here I'm reminded of Vanessa Andreotti's work. She argues that if we are to find a new civilization, we need to give up on the hope for the old futures we grew up with and that we thought we wanted and loved. She argues that it's only by grieving for an old civilization to which we're still emotionally wedded and hospicing it through its final days to death that we can begin to create the possibility for different and better futures to emerge. The critical issue, therefore, is to be attentive to the work that our emotions do when we think about the future, to explore when our emotions are blinding us to possibilities in any situation. And we need to think about what builds our capacity to deal with the fears and desires that thinking about the future brings. How do we do this? If we think of our own lives, the response many of us would make is that friendship, family, and community are the ways in which we get through difficult times and navigate a changing landscape. These relationships based on love and care can provide support and solace during difficult times. What would schools look like if they understood that their primary responsibility was to develop students' capacity to love, to be loved, and to build lasting friendships? What would schools look like if their role was not to rescue children from communities, but to support students to build the communities that will sustain them through uncertain times? So to conclude, we need to recognize that there is no single and simple tomorrow that we are preparing young people for. There are many possibilities, all latent in today. And so we need an education that is committed to resisting the closing down of the future to a simplistic vision, whether of technological transformation, cutthroat economic competition, or environmental crisis. We need schools that are laboratories in which young people and teachers work together to explore and create new possibilities in the present. So for those of us working in education, this means, as I've said, We need to draw out of our existing curriculum the way it supports students to act in and on the future by developing the skills of reflexivity, stewardship, modelling, and experimentation. It means giving students real opportunities to think about, practice, and experiment with how change happens. And finally, it means creating schools that can help young people deal with the emotions of working with the future. This means building young people's capacities to love, build friendship, and community. But I need to make one last point, and it's a point that Sharon made earlier, which is we need to recognize that education cannot transform a society on its own. Education is part of a much more complex system that is made up of social actors and forces that are pushing in different directions. Educators cannot promise to solve the world's problems in isolation. Alliances and partnerships are needed between educators and the wider society to address the forces that are closing down the open future. So what does this mean for those of you who are working outside education? It means we need to recognize that education is a collective social responsibility that cannot simply be left to schools. It means we have to support those teachers who are attempting to experiment with new approaches. Creating schools as future-making laboratories will not be easy and will not happen overnight. And finally, it means that we have to work together to create a better political climate for education. We need to challenge the current direction of international OECD-led education policy. We need to point out that it is a crazy, individualized, information-obsessed, linear, measurement-fixated system. We need to argue that it is getting in the way of education's capacity to support students to deal with the intellectual, emotional, and practical challenges of a complex and rapidly changing world. Above all, though, we need as educators and citizens to fight for education to be a space of the unexpected, of surprise, in which the unique contribution of each individual is understood as the beginnings of a new future that we cannot possibly imagine. Valuing that diversity, understanding the strength in an abundance of different ways of being the world is the only rational response to a world of unknowable and uncertain futures. Crucially, we have to remember we have survived major change before. The 19th century saw electric light, phonographs, wireless, cinema, mass production. And the educational response was rich. We invented playgrounds, new school spaces, universal primary education, widening access to higher education, and laws banning child labor. We had a rich educational imagination, and we need one now that is fueled by the old phrase, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Thank you for listening.